Welcome to Psych Sessions on Teaching and Learning Centers. My name is Chris Hackala, and I'm your podcast host. In this series of conversations, we speak with folks who have made the leap from a traditional faculty member position to a role in a Center for Teaching and Learning. The conversations focus on how individuals moved from faculty to a center and how that move impacted their work, their career trajectory, and their personal and professional identity. Along the way, we talk about tips, advice, and challenges that come from working in a center. Sit back and enjoy these chats on Psych Sessions on Teaching and Learning Centers. I'm really happy to be here today with Kevin Gannon, who has recently started as the director for the Center for Advancement of Faculty Excellence and Professor of History at Queen's University in Charlotte. Kevin, thanks for chatting with me today.
It's great to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
So, Kevin, as I said when we were chatting before, I followed your career a little bit. I've read your book, Radical Hope. I saw you present at a conference, and I'm really happy to be chatting with you because, as I mentioned, I'm always curious about where people come from and how people emerge into this field. So I'm wondering if you can sort of walk me through your pathway from like undergraduate, graduate into your career, so we can sort of see how you ended up where you are now.
Sure, yeah. So I was, for the first several years of my undergraduate experience, a fairly indifferent student. And
a lot of us.
Right. And so that experience actually shapes a lot of what I do now. Poor choices, not very good at allocating unstructured time, things like that, but very connected with my major, which was history. And I went to James Madison University as an undergrad, and there was a great history department there with some really great teachers and faculty who really did take the time to mentor me in ways that I hadn't really earned, to be quite honest.
So that's really interesting. And I told you before, I'll ask you lots of questions. This is really interesting to me because I do think that the connection between major and person and the people in that major and person matters so much in undergraduate education. I don't think we pay enough attention to that because I have a similar story. I went to small school and I was mentored by some people who, despite my indifference, took an interest in me and really helped me. I think that's fascinating. So feel free to call out anybody by name too if you have anybody you want to.
Skip Heiser, who was my first year advisor at James Madison, and Mike Galgano was the chair while I was an undergrad. Chris Arndt, I could go on and, but those were three folks in particular who I took several classes with and who I remain close with and friends with today.
Yeah.
They have all either recently retired or will be soon retiring. So it makes them feel old and me feel old at this point.
Yeah, I hear you.
But, out of that, I went, I had originally thought I might teach high school, but then I took a couple classes in the secondary ed program and I went out and did some observations at the local high school. And after about an hour, I was like, nope, this is not for me. I don't want to teach kids like I was in high school, basically. And had already been thinking about graduate education and, so that kind of solidified it and was lucky enough to kind of get my act together with, again, some good membership and end up in graduate school for history. And when I took my PhD and entered into the job market, I wanted to go somewhere where I could teach history. Teaching has always had a really strong pull with me. But I don't think I really envisioned doing anything differently in terms of standard academic history professor, right? And, so when I started at my previous institution in 2004, I was, just a regular history professor looking to do regular history professor things. But because it was a small school, and which, I had gone to large state schools for my whole education. So being in that environment really kind of keyed me into just how much and how diverse faculty roles are. Right. And so I had the opportunity to get involved in a lot of things right away. At my previous institution, a Title III grant had just gone into effect. So I was participating as faculty in learning communities. There were substantial resources for professional development. The Title III grant had created a teaching center
Mm-hmm.
So, and with a pretty good budget. And so we had summer teaching and learning institutes. My first few years there, this was Grandview University in Iowa.
Uh-huh.
We had Craig Nelson and Dee
Oh,
Fink, and so that was my introduction to faculty development. Were these folks, and as a faculty member, I was really enthusiastic about participating in these things and taking a lot out of them for my classes. And when the position to direct the center, when that opportunity came open, my predecessor decided to return to the faculty, and she had been kind of a teaching mentor to me as well. And so when that position opened up, I felt like I'd been kind of moving in that direction. I really enjoyed the center's programming. I was on the advisory council for it, and so it just seemed like kind of a logical next step. And so I applied, and in 2014 moved into educational development, which if you'd have told me 10 years beforehand that would be where my career moved, I would have looked at you like you had three heads, right? And
yeah.
And that position was still faculty. I remained on the faculty. It was a 50% release from teaching to direct the center. But the position I'm in now is directing a faculty development shop in a much more holistic way, and embracing both not just teaching and learning, although that's certainly at the heart of it, but faculty scholarly work, service, and in particular leadership development. And I am now academic staff, which is a shift for me, and has been weird, sounds bad, but just different, in the way that I conceive of kind of what's my role now. I will be teaching some in this position, but it won't be a 2 course a semester load like I'm used to. And, so for this fall, I'm not teaching as I get acclimated to the position. My administrators here really wanted to create enough time for me to sort of sufficiently get on board, and which I appreciate. Yeah. But it is really strange for the first time in 24 years to not be prepping a fall class.
So that's really interesting. And so in our careers, 2014 is when I went into faculty development as well. So that's really interesting. But the part about the academic staff is fascinating to me. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of different opinions about this, about whether or not folks should carry the title. Now, I know you carry the title Professor of History. Mm-hmm. Is that what they call a courtesy title at your institution?
Yeah, faculty standing, I think. So I have faculty rank, but I do not have tenure. I did leave a tenured position to take this role.
Oh, Kevin, yes, as did I. And I think it's an interesting move because it has an impact on your professional identity. And one of the things that I think I've struggled with over the years is how to keep my faculty identity with psychology and my professional identity with the organizations I used to engage with, and continue to do the work in faculty development. And I'll be curious over the next several years to hear how you navigate that, because it is as if you have 2 camps that you are serving. It's a different kind of world. So
and the way you put it is exactly how I feel like where I'm standing now. And, I told my new provost, who's wonderful. And I just said, look, this is a change in identity, like the way I see myself and what I do. And it'll take a little getting used to. And so, trying to navigate that, keep in touch. And I still do some historical scholarship, and I have a textbook project I'm working on. And so in that sense, I remain connected. But the teaching thing is, I think it will be different when I find out kind of what that'll look like down the road here, and where I might be best of service in our curriculum.
Yeah. And I think that the teaching piece is going to be really interesting, because there are people who talk about how teaching center folks need to stay connected to the students and need to stay connected to the job itself. And how do you do that in a way that allows you to balance the responsibilities of the center and serve your students the way that you want to? And that it's an evolving process that takes a lot of time and skill to navigate. And I suspect you will, over the next couple of years, figure that out.
Well, and, in my previous position where I was still teaching 2 courses a term, I felt like I wasn't doing either aspect of that job well, right? Like I've never felt like I had enough time for my students, but I also never felt like I had enough time for center work. And that was kind of an uneasy tension. And so, I agree with you in the sense that I think it's really important to think about how we as educational developers are connected with all of faculty work, right? Mm-hmm. If we're supporting a larger faculty and academic staff, I do think it's important to be able to know the students in the way that a classroom instructor, whether on site or online, gets to know students. And I do think there is, kind of a street cred thing. Faculty members don't want to be told how to teach, so to speak, from people who aren't teaching regularly. And at schools like ours, where teaching is kind of a heart of our identity and a big part of faculty work, I think that does matter. And so I don't know what the solution to that is. I think it's a lot more context specific, but I do think at least semi-regular teaching for this kind of work in this kind of institution is probably a requirement.
Yeah, and I think that what you just said is really important. Is it really needs to be institutionally contextualized, right? Mm-hmm. So different institutions have different ways of viewing these things, and I think that if you look at some of the institutions that I know who have teaching center directors who don't teach, they don't teach, but faculty understand what they bring to the table and they see that. And then there are places where faculty do teach. And I think it really does have to do with the culture of the institution. But I also think that speaks to a bigger issue, and that is that our careers and our jobs really have evolved in a very interesting time where there's been this proliferation of centers, in particular at smaller schools, without a pathway to get there, really. We all kind of find our way there. And without really a clear job description. I mean, your job and my job actually sound kind of similar, but I talk to some people and what they do is not what I do at all. And so we're in this sort of field and I think that the best metaphor I've ever come up with is one point in my life, I thought I wanted to fly small planes, and I got up in a Cessna and I was flying it around. And by the way, once was enough for me. Once was enough. But as I was up there, I didn't have any sort of contact with the ground. And I just felt like I was feathering my way through and kind of finding my way through. That's kind of what it feels like in this job. You don't have the grounding of a department and the semester and all of that in the same way.
No, that's absolutely right. And it also, I think, reflects kind of the changing ways in which educational development is serving institutions, right? Mm-hmm. It's no longer just, hey, do teaching and learning workshops and help our faculty teach better. And for many of us, that's still a really big component of what we do. Uh-huh. But I know that, whether it was my previous place or here at Queens, there's a much more strategic element, an institutional element to the position. How am I supporting what the institution's doing in terms of its strategic initiatives? How am I helping not just support individual faculty, but advocating for, good teaching and learning, advocating for the conditions in which that can take place? How am I creating space for a scholarly culture that emphasizes things like SOTL, for example. And so, and especially at small colleges, right? Because, we end up wearing several hats by default. And I think that's where some of the interesting evolution, has really come as you talk about here, ways in which we're still kind of one foot in traditional, quote unquote, faculty development. Mm-hmm. But then another foot in educational development, that is that larger institutional focus and maybe a broader lens. And I remember when I had the opportunity to chair the small colleges special interest group with Pod, and I remember meeting folks at the first Pod meeting, and everybody was going around talking about where they were and what kind of center they did, and sort of like the island of misfit toys, right? There was a little bit of everything, and we had come into it in different ways, and some of us were still kind of stunned we were even there, but I think you're right in that it has been small colleges where we've seen a real proliferation of centers. And I think that what we're seeing, especially with COVID, faculty developers, as you've written about, took an enormous amount of initiative and played an enormous role in helping navigate what was a really precarious time, especially for small institutions. And I think we're seeing the position evolve and change because of that. And I think that ultimately that's a positive thing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, there's a number of things you said there that I think are fascinating. One of which is, you're absolutely right. I think in some ways we've become the problem-solving solution center on a campus. Something comes up, especially at small schools. But one of the things I find funny as you were talking about it is that there are days where I look at what I'm doing and I think, why am I doing this? So, for example, I am now, for reasons that are unclear to me, I'm in charge of classroom furniture. That's now my thing. So now I get this call. This classroom needs new furniture. Go find new furniture for this. Now that doesn't mean I can go buy new furniture. Make no mistake, we don't have any money. That means I go to the warehouse and I find stuff and then I put it in. And do I sometimes move the furniture myself? Well, yeah, sometimes I rearrange furniture myself. And that's the nature of small colleges. And I think that that's okay because it is important for understanding how a classroom's set up for teaching and learning. And it's tangential, but you do find yourself doing things that are often not exactly what you imagine. And it's funny, I have a dear friend, a guy named Victor Benassi. And Victor, he ran a teaching center at University of New Hampshire, and he ran my seminar and practicum in teaching when I was a grad student there. And Victor, his teaching center was a science of learning teaching center. You want to work with us? We're going to design a science of learning project. We're going to test it. We're going to collect the data. And we're going to publish it. And that's all they did. And they did it really well, but that's all they did. And so when I tell him some of the things I do, he laughs at me and says, that's just dumb. You shouldn't be doing that. I said, no, Victor, it's okay. It's okay. It's the right thing for me to do. And I think that that's where what you're saying is we have to sort of be flexible. But I think what's most important that came out of COVID is a recognition that we have a lot to contribute in ways they hadn't thought of before. And that's where I think we get a seat at the table. Now, I know you've done a lot of writing on equity and inclusive teaching. And I think that that's where we also can have some impact in talking to faculty about these issues that are about teaching, but not about teaching, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, we are in roles that are sort of uniquely positioned to help not just have those conversations, but to help guide them in ways that get traction under them and that are productive, right? I mean, yeah. In the work that we do, we're working with faculty and teaching staff from across different disciplines. We're different career stages. And so if we're having an institutional conversation about, well, what does equitable teaching look like? What does justice-oriented teaching look like compared to where we are? What are we doing well? What can we scale out? What do we still need to work on? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's educational developers that have the biggest or the widest lens into what we need to answer those questions effectively and can speak to that rather than just one departmental complex or context, for example. And I found that I think one of the most rewarding parts of the job, if I just stayed teaching history and occasionally a new student seminar, I mean, that'd have been cool and everything, but it's, revolutionized the way I look at teaching and learning, being exposed to what different colleagues and different disciplines have done. And to be able to use that then to help shape and guide conversations and to support, our chief diversity officer, to support, folks who are, student life folks who are talking about creating cultures of belonging where students can succeed. And, so to be able to mobilize all of that and to support folks in doing that work and then help connect them with faculty, which isn't always easy for the student affairs folks, right?
Yeah.
That's, I like being in a position to help make those connections and then see what those connections are able to do as a result. That to me is, I think, one of the biggest advantages of doing what we do at the places that we do it.
Yeah. And I think, I couldn't agree more. I think these are really important points. And I think one of the things that I found really fascinating as I've had conversations about equitable teaching was a conversation I once had, and I'll be curious if you have the same response I did, when I was talking to a group of faculty and I naively believed that everybody sort of understood this. And I said, we're all aware that on student evaluations at the end of the semester, there are differences in response as a function of who the person is in front of the room. So, for example, females have a different set of criteria that they're often judged upon than males. And I had an older male faculty member who said, no, students are smart enough not to do that. They don't treat females any different. And that was my response. And I tried to hold it back. I didn't have to say much because the women in the room were all over it and said, oh, no. And I thought, oh, these are conversations to have because people aren't aware of these things. They have their blind spots where they don't see these kinds of things. So I think that's really important. The other thing I think you said that's really, I think, really critical is that at a small school, someone who can make those connections, who can serve as a connector between different places is incredibly valuable because those student affairs professionals have a lot to say and they don't often get the audience of the people where they can help. And so if we can make those connections, it makes a better situation for our students. And that's really what it's all about.
Yeah. And I think, too, at smaller schools, my theory is it's actually almost easier to get siloed and disconnected at smaller places because we have this narrative about ourselves, right? That we tell ourselves and everybody, oh, we're small and everybody knows one another.
Yeah.
And, and that becomes the substitute for actually doing the work. Of sustaining those connections. And then all of a sudden it's 4 years later and half the staff in this new office is people I don't know. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter how small campus is, I can't tell you this person's name. Right. And
yeah.
So I think at smaller schools, it's even more incumbent on those of us who occupy kind of these intersections between, student success and academic affairs, for example, to really be mindful of not falling into that trap and to help our colleagues not get into that place either.
Yeah. So let me ask you, what's your structure of your center? So do you have staff? Do you have space? Where do you sit within the institution?
So I report to our associate provost for academic affairs, who reports directly up to the provost. I do have space. I have an office. I have an active learning classroom attached to the center. I have what's called, interactive digital learning space, which has one of those light boards in it, which I need to learn how to use. But it's kind of an experimental space. It's small physically, but it's got a bunch of stuff in it and faculty of, kind of an innovation space. And I've got a conference room. I do not have staff, but I do have administrative support through the provost and associate provost's office.
Okay, so you're a center of one.
I am a center of one.
Interesting. So one of the things that'll be interesting over the next couple of years is to see what happens. I started as a center of one with a graduate student, and I've grown to a center of 7 in a 5-year span as COVID changed the way that they envisioned the center. I essentially picked up all the instructional design team and all of that. And so I think what's interesting is that as you find your niche in the institution, what unfolds over the next several years, because people see the value that you bring to the table. So I think that's really interesting.
Well, one of the interesting things about that, so at my prior institution, I had an instructional technologist who was also our LMS administrator working under me in the center. And we handled classroom technology. We handled online faculty. We handled basically instructional design work. I was the backup LMS admin. I administered our university Zoom account. Like we were deeply involved.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of a tech geek, and so that worked, right? Yeah. It worked in the sense that I knew how to do it, and that it was busy as hell. Yeah. But here at Queens, we have a Center for Digital Learning, which has instructional designer, LMS admin. I will still be doing work with faculty, mostly on the pedagogy side. I don't have to worry about the under the hood nuts and bolts stuff. I don't have to onboard people onto our learning management system out of this. Yeah. The Hayworth Center for Digital Learning will be doing that. And let me tell you, that's, it's an amazing thing to be at a place that has a center dedicated to doing that kind of work, but also in partnership with the faculty development side of things. Like I stepped into a situation where, the folks at the Hayworth Center were some of the first people I met with on campus. We talked about, okay, what do we need? How can we collaborate? How can I support what you're doing? And I think, honestly, I think some folks here were like, scared that I would be mad that I didn't get to do some of I was like, oh, please, I've had enough. Take all you want. I am perfectly happy not being a backup administration for the LMS. Like I will gladly relinquish those parts of my old position. And so I'm excited that, at a small college to have that kind of shop, an instructional design and we have some master's programs that are either fully online or low residency. And so that structure is really developed here, and the people doing it are great. And so that changes a little bit of the equation in terms of thinking about, what am I doing on a day-to-day basis, but also, what are some of the things that we need for faculty development where I don't have to necessarily do like Canvas training, for example.
Yeah, great. So, and I think that kind of thing is really interesting. I mean, when I inherited instructional design and an academic technology person, it increased the amount of responsibility I have, and it does change your ability to focus. and there's pros and cons
Yeah.
to every model.
And I learned a ton. I was an online teacher anyway. I've been teaching online for almost 10 years
Okay.
myself. So for me, it was a nice convergence and kind of a way to scale out some of what I was doing and some of the experience I'd gotten and some of the projects I'd gotten to work on. But it was also a lot.
Yeah.
And like you say, there were times, especially during the pandemic, we went to fully high flex.
Oh.
And so I was frontline support for, classroom technology, high flex in general. I built a high flex course on teaching high flex for all my faculty colleagues in the summer of 2020. And I felt like one of those acrobats that holds the poles and is spinning all the plates and the cups.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Except everything was falling all the time. So I don't miss having all of that. On my plate. I get to focus in on, okay, let's talk about the pedagogy side of this. Let's talk about the teaching and learning side of these tools and of this modality. And that's a place I'm happier that way.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So let me ask you, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Can you tell me something that you've done in a center that you think is one of the most effective, highest impact kind of things you've done in your career?
So a lot of folks and a lot of us do like course design or course redesign institutes. And I did that too, and they went okay. But I reshaped the one I was doing to be explicitly focused on like justice and equity oriented course design. So folding in a lot of UDL, a lot of access, a lot of anti-racist teaching, a lot of, and really explicitly, saying this is the set of values from which we're approaching this, and here's why this could be an effective set of lenses for us to use. And part of it was my own proclivities, and part of it was there were some real institutional needs that we needed to address, and some things that we really needed to do better with, quite frankly. And I was a little nervous about how that would go. I knew I had a lot of faculty who were in that space who were sympathetic and fully on board, but then I had some other faculty who were basically told, like, you have to redesign this course. And so go to this course, but it went amazingly. We had just really rich conversations, in the way, in the best sense of the term, we were challenging one another, challenging our assumptions, really deeply interrogating everything. Like, why do we have deadlines? Why do we give exams this way? What are the equity implications of the assessment plans we have? Really, and this was all prior to COVID. And so having those conversations already, I think, helped us navigate the uncertainty of COVID teaching a lot better. But that Redesign Institute, I don't know if it was anything I did necessarily other than try to create the space, but the collaboration and the tough but loving conversations that happened. I had one senior colleague who left after the final day, and he was like, I've been here 20 something years and I've never had a good conversation on teaching and learning like the one we just had. And I was like, that's it. That's what we're after.
Yeah, that's great. And that's those kinds of situations when we have that kind of sort of synergy in the development of that feeling that you walk out, that you just really help faculty think through those issues. Those are wonderful to have, and every one of our experiences is like that, right? I mean, we always.
I wish.
So, have you ever had anything not go so well?
I'm going to try to do a faculty learning community here at my new position. But I've never had one of those work well before. I have struggled with those. And I think and with the assessment I've done and the folks that I've talked to, when these things, they start well and then they kind of, poof out. And I think a lot of it is just the product of the absolutely insane workloads that we all have. And certainly faculty have at small teaching, tuition dependent colleges. And, at my old place, we were a 4-4 load if you were full-time faculty, but most of my colleagues taught overload. So the folks who were really invested in doing, let's say, a faculty learning community on inclusive pedagogy, they're, if they're teaching a 5-5 overload, so September into October, we did great, even into early November. But man, it just, And that was the pattern every time I've tried it. And so, I'm going to try to do faculty learning communities here at Queens, and I'm hoping for success. But that has been one of my biggest struggles, is not necessarily starting, but sustaining them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's pretty, I've heard that from other people. And I think it's really challenging because the time issue is a big one. I mean, faculty are interested in committing to these things, but when the time comes and they have to make tough decisions about what to do, these are easy things to just sort of put to the back burner because they have other things to do that are more immediate in nature. So
and I had one colleague tell me, he said, "Look, I'm really sorry I'm not coming." He goes, "But you are literally the only thing on my calendar this week that isn't required."
Yeah.
And I mean, and in that position, I would be doing the same thing. And so maybe there are ways that we can use that kind of experience to have the larger institutional conversation about, are we allocating time and support for the things that we say we value, or are we not? Right. So
that's a really interesting point. And I know we're coming up on time, but I want to talk about this a minute because this is really important to me. I think, given what I know about the work you do, and I'm suspecting this because this is something I do. I look for those things to open up the larger conversations in any way I can if it's something I feel very strongly about. And this is one of them, this notion that we want to say teaching and learning is really the most important thing we do at the institution, yet we reward other things more than we reward evidence of effective teaching and learning. And I think that feels wrong to me. And so I do exactly what you said you can do, is take that and use that as just sort of a wedge to get in there and have that bigger conversation. Because I think as institutions, given the nature of higher ed, Kevin, if we're not doing this really well, people are going to take their money elsewhere.
Yeah. And the way I always think about it is, in terms of the faculty experience or even institutionally, the three most precious resources we have: money, time, and what we might call emotional energy or cognitive bandwidth, right?
Yep.
And so we have to ask, how are we allocating those? And does that align with the values that we're professing? So if we say we're teaching centric, and a lot of my faculty colleagues find themselves allocating a lot of time and a lot of their emotional energy to, let's say, committee work, maybe that aligns with the mission of the university, but probably not. So how do we fix that? How do we use our resources strategically? It's like the old Biden quote, right? Don't tell me what you think is important. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you think is important.
Right. That's right.
And I'm a big fan. Our mission statements are really underutilized resources for this. Is our work mission driven? And I know people like to make fun of mission statements as like corporate speak and marketing, but they're promises. We make those promises to our entire community. And so are we in alignment with what our mission says we are? And if we're not, we better think about how we get there. And that's where I think there's some productive space to have exactly those types of conversations.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point and a great way for us to sort of to tie this up. So Kevin, I wanted to thank you so much for your time and for the conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate you doing this.
Oh, thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure.
Thanks.